Thank you guys so much. And Leslie, and Gloria for those great memories. Thank you for thinking about me and remembering. It's always amazing when you hear people recollect your first meetings, and it really honors me that you did that. So thank you so much. And it's great to be here today. Kristen, thank you so much for organizing this. And we got to have a little chat beforehand and with Gloria and Kristen and I. So I'm very excited to talk to you guys a little bit about my book. And I thought I would kick things off since, Janus is a pretty well-known entity. I'm pretty sure everyone here has heard of Janus. Horribly, it's hard. 50 years ago, October is when we lost her, when she passed away at the age of 27. So I thought I would kick things off today just by reading just a little snippet from the introduction of my book, which tries to explain to the reader, whether it's someone our age who grew up knowing Janus's music and seeing her as a real groundbreaking artist, or people my son's age, college students like the ones I teach at SUNY New Paltz, who kind of have an idea of her, maybe know a song or two, but don't know much about her. And I wanted to show how her legacy is still with us today. So I'll read a little snippet of that. And then I'm going to go back to Geraldine, I think it was Geraldine's question about why did I decide to write this book? Because you guys probably know there are a few Janis Joplin books out there, especially you can imagine someone with her stature over 50 years since she passed away, there would be a few books. So why do I add to the canon? So I am going to tell you guys in just a second. But first off, I'm going to read a little bit from my book. Can everybody hear me okay? Is the volume working and I'm coming through? Okay, awesome. Okay, of course Janus was just this walking amazing quote factory. She really knew how to give quotes to journalists. And there could be a whole line of t-shirts with little blurbs across the front with Janis Joplin quotations. So each chapter in my book kicks off with a quote from Janis, except on one occasion before she could really start piping up, there was a quote from her dad, who she very much inherited his intellectualism and his love of books and words and writing, etc. So I kick off the book with this quote. You might have heard it, it's pretty famous from Janis. "Don't compromise yourself. It's all you've got." Okay. It's a steamy September night in Nashville, and Ruby Boots is tearing it up on stage at the Basement East, thrashing her electric guitar and belting Janis Joplin's "Piece of My Heart." The 2018 edition of the 6-day Americana Fest, an annual music conference and festival, is honoring albums from 1968, and Big Brother and the holding company's breakthrough, Cheap Thrills, has made the cut. Ruby Boots, born Bex Chilcott in Perth, Australia, fell in love with Janis's music as a kid, growing up on the other side of the world. The irresistible, aching soul in Janis's voice, undiminished by time, distance, and even mortality. As when Janis herself unleashed this tune 50 years ago, the crowd, wired into its raw but fearless humanity, pushes toward the stage. At the Americana Honors and Music Awards show, held at the Ryman Auditorium, former home of the Grand Ole Opry, numerous Janis acolytes take the stage. Singer-songwriter activist Rosanne Cash, a Janis fan since her teens, wins the Free Speech and Music Award. Alberta, Canada native Katie Lang, who went public as a lesbian in 1991, gets the Trailblazer Award. Formidable singers Brandi Carlile, Margot Price, and Courtney Marie Andrews, all nominees for various honors, signal Janis's influence in their blazing performances. Prior to Janis Joplin's all too brief time in the spotlight, these artists would have been hard-pressed to find a female role model to compare with the beatnik from Port Arthur, Texas. The mix of confident musicianship, brash sexuality, and natural exuberance locked together to produce America's first female rock star changed everything. As such, Janis still holds sway over multiple generations, artists of countless genres across the gender spectrum. And although her bookishness, sharp intellect, and deep desire for home with the requisite white picket fence were not at the forefront of the identity she crafted for her fans, those parts of her also informed her every move. The same could be said of her pioneering instincts. While Janis's era is largely considered a time of release from the strictures of the 1950s, rock was, in fact, almost exclusively a boys' club, and Janis suffered appalling sexism from both the mainstream and counterculture press, and cold, occasionally cruel dismissiveness from industry pros. Yet she blazed on. Through force of will and unprecedented talent, she showed how rock could include unapologetic women, musicians, writers, and fans. Feminist Ellen Willis, a New Yorker music critic in the 1960s, called Janis, quote, the only 60s culture hero to make visible and public women's experience of the quest for individual liberation, end quote. Patti Smith, Blondie's Debbie Harry, Cyndi Lauper, Chrissie Hynde, the B-52's Kate Pierson, and Heart's Ann and Nancy Wilson are among the artists who experienced Janis firsthand. They began to breathe in the possibility of their own futures. When Stevie Nicks was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in March 2019, she said that playing on a bill with Janis in the 1960s transformed her. Quote, her connection with the audience was so incredible that I said, I want to do what she did, end quote. Through her influence and her own enduring work, Janis Joplin remains at the core of our music and culture. As we look back at pivotal moments in 1960s rock history, she is usually there. The Monterey Pop Festival, the vibrant Haight-Ashbury scene in San Francisco, the streets, clubs, and studios of gritty New York City, Woodstock. She's been feted at museum exhibitions and the subject of theater productions and films. Her first solo album, The Eclectic Daring Departure, I Got Them Old Cosmic Blues Again, Mama, sounds as fresh today as upon its 1969 release. Her Monterey Pop performance, documented by filmmaker D.A. Pennebaker, still brings wild applause from a new generation of audiences at screenings, and with YouTube viewers in the millions and counting. When Janis hit that Monterey stage in June 1967, few outside San Francisco knew her name. What is this girl all about? Monterey co-producer Lou Adler wondered. Where did she come from, looking like that and leading this all-male band? Offering a clue, Haight-Ashbury impresario Chet Helms introduced her on stage. Quote, 3 or 4 years ago, on one of my perennial hitchhikes across the country, I ran into a chick from Texas by the name of Janis Joplin, he told the unsuspecting crowd. I heard her sing, and Janis and I hitchhiked to the West Coast. A lot of things have gone down since then, but it gives me a lot of pride today to present the finished product. Big Brother and the Holding Company. Hooray! Janis's astonishing performance that day would change her life and the future of popular music. By the time the 5-song set ended with her dramatic reinvention of R&B blues singer Willie Mae Thornton's Ball and Chain, thousands of mind-blown fans and hundreds of dazzled journalists knew her name and fervently spread the news. Her emotion-drenched vocal style took hold upon other developing singers, Led Zeppelin's Robert Plant among them. Young women who saw her on stage at the Avalon Ballroom or Bill Graham's Fillmore venues still recall the experience. It was like she was singing to or for them, telling their stories, feeling their pain, emboldening them, and absolving them of shame. Janis was a walking live nerve, capable of surfacing feelings that most people couldn't or wouldn't, and she was willing to endure the toll it took on her. Janis never compromised her vision. She wasn't afraid to cross boundaries, musical, cultural, and sexual. Openly bisexual in an era when it was illegal, she was not afraid of jail, of judgment. Similarly, when critics and fans expressed umbrage at her audacity to quit her role as chick singer in a band that she felt was holding her back, she did it anyway. Just 4 days before her death on October 4th, 1970, she told journalist Howard Smith, quote, "You're only as much as you settle for." Janis Joplin never settled. Her distinctive voice sounds as powerful today as it did when introduced on the airwaves in 1967. More so than any of her peers, it cuts through the digital din, the noise of our age, and lands exactly where Janis wanted, deep inside the heart. Since her time, her work and life have inspired so many women to create their own sounds and walk their own uncompromising paths, from Lucinda Williams to Pink, Amy Winehouse to Carolyn Wonderland, Lady Gaga to Brittany Howard, Alicia Keys to Florence Welch, Grace Potter to Elle King, Melissa Etheridge to Kesha. Lucinda Williams has written a song about her, Port Arthur. Pink hoped to play her in a film. Carolyn Wonderland does a wonderful killer version of a 1962 Janis original, What Good Can Drinkin' Do? Melissa Etheridge helped induct her into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1995. That night, Etheridge said, quote, "When a soul can look on the world and see and feel the pain and loneliness and can reach deep down inside and find a voice to sing of it, a soul can heal." Perhaps that remains Janis's greatest gift. Thank you. So I think we need Janis right now. That music, I know, has really helped me through this really difficult time of loss, and I hope it has you guys as well. And I find myself turning back to her music and listening to it, and even after, you know, obsessing over it and listening to it nonstop for these many years that I worked on her book since 2015, basically, I still haven't gotten tired of it. And again, you know, going back to that question that started off our gathering was why? Why did I decide to write this book? It is my third biography, and but funnily enough, the idea kind of crossed my mind even before my most recent biography, the one about Alex Chilton, which came out in 2014. And in fact, digging deep into Janis's work and history started even before my first biography of Gene Autry, which came out back in 2007. I was working at Rolling Stone back in those days, and I had this idea of Janis in my mind based pretty much on what little information there was about her that came my way when I was a teenager and first discovered her music when I was about 13, when Pearl came out. I grew up in a very small town in North Carolina. There wasn't a lot of access to you know, hippies and counterculture and rock and roll and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, I had limited resources, and Pearl, though, with its big hit, Me and Bobby McGee, definitely was on the AM little clock radio I listened to. And in fact, I ordered a copy of the album when I joined the Columbia House Record Club, and I got 12 albums for a penny. I don't know if you guys remember that. But that definitely was my favorite one, better than like Blood, Sweat, and Tears and whatever else I got. And I just, you know, literally wore that record out. Like I can still picture myself sitting in my lavender walled bedroom on my green shag carpet, listening to my record player and just playing that record over and over and over again. And she just really affected me. And I have this memory, and I think it's a real memory, of seeing her like before she died, before Pearl came out, because that came out in 71 posthumously, but seeing her on the Dick Cavett show and just being kind of astounded by this woman who was this amazing singer who had this crazy but very cool look about her with her outfits and her, you know, at this point she had the hot pink fuchsia kind of bow in her hair, but really just having this repartee with this intellectual, you know, he was kind of, I guess, the Stephen Colbert of his day, right? Dick Cavett, this incredible conversation, and then that voice. And I didn't know much about her. And then, of course, we've got the news that she died, which seems so horrible and shocking. And the first thing I really read about her was Myra Friedman's book that came out. I don't know if any of you guys ever read it, that came out in, I guess it was around the mid 70s. And Myra had been Janis's published. She worked for Albert Grossman, who had a home up here in Bearsville, of course, and a recording studio and offices. And so Myra was kind of like a mother figure really to Janis. They were quite different, but she really loved Janis's music and thought she was incredible. But you know, she, I think, was very much still grieving when Janis died, and she started writing this book, which is quite well written. But I discovered when I started researching Janis and meeting more people that knew her and finding out more about her, that it kind of was really, a book was more about Myra than I think it was about Janis. And I think part of it was that, and I now discovered much older, having sadly, and as I'm sure we all have, lost loved ones now in our lives, and you realize you go through the grieving process and there's that anger part, you know. And I remember when I first heard about that, I always thought it was like, you're angry at God, like, why did you take them away? But then I realized later there was this anger that you feel, and especially if it's a friend who died young, through like a misadventure or whatever, you feel really angry at that person that they left you. And I think now that Myra's book was colored by that, she felt a lot of anger at that time towards Janis because of the loss, because she really did love her. But I, you know, walked away from that book thinking of Janis as this victim, this incredibly gifted singer who just kind of was on this downward spiral and self-destructed, and was just this kind of big mess of emotion and, you know, bad behavior and self-destruction, basically. And you know, that was how I thought of her for years. But as I worked at Rolling Stone and I had the opportunity to actually meet people that performed with Janis, who were in her bands, her road manager, her siblings, and particularly when her sister published some letters in a book that she wrote, a memoir about growing up with her sister called Love, Janis, I started seeing this other part of Janis that I had not gotten at all from Myra's book. And it was really this very smart woman who would, you know, clearly paint a certain picture when she wrote letters home to her family, and she wrote a lot. She was a prolific letter writer. But she was writing about the music as being this craft that she was working very, very hard to develop, that she was learning how to work in the studio. In fact, much more even than the guys in Big Brother and the Holding Company, she loved being in the studio. She loved the whole process, the engineering process. She would write these letters, these very articulate letters home, where she'd be describing, you know, overdubbing vocals or double tracking vocals, the mixing process, all these, you know, techno geeky, you know, kind of things. And believe me, I used to play in bands back in the 80s and got to go in the studio a few times. And let me tell you something, it's totally different from being up on stage, emoting. I mean, it's a total other side of the brain. It takes a lot of, you know, perseverance, intense focus. You have to have your, you know, shit together, pardon my French, but you know, you can't be bombed on Southern Comfort or whatever and work hard in the studio. It just doesn't work. And so, and then also to recount what that's like and describe the process to her parents. And so and then I started finding out even more that Janis, you know, it wasn't her first rodeo when she went out to California and joined Big Brother and the Holding Company in 1966, that she had actually been trying to make it as a musician all the way back to 1962 when she was in college at the University of Texas. That prior to that, she wanted to be an artist. She wanted to be a painter, and she pursued painting for a long time. And that's what she studied in college. She went to school 3 times, basically. And so at the University of Texas, though, she was befriended by a group of musicians who were into the whole folk scene at that period of time. Of course, guys. You know, women were very much left out of this. There was Joan Baez was the one shining example at that point in time, and she was very much an idol of Janis's. But Janis fell in with these guys called the Waller Creek Boys that played kind of bluegrass, you know, some Woody Guthrie kind of stuff, some old balladry. And Janis, growing up in, you know, East Texas, the Gulf Coast of Texas, Port Arthur, oil refinery town, had discovered the African American music of her area and became madly in love with it and studied it, and was able to, even though she was a white girl living in a very, in a segregated town that was actually quite, horribly racist in her area, she broke down those color barriers and sought out and found 78 recordings of blues singers and studied these records as if they were, dissertations or something, and learned the phrasing, and she totally changed the way she sang. She was born with this beautiful soprano voice. Her mother was a great singer, but she wanted to sound different. She wanted to find her own voice, and she did that by way of listening to this African American music and listening to Lead Belly, to Bessie Smith, Ma Rainey, Big Mama Thornton, actually, who really, in this Poetic Justice, it was a song that Big Mama Thornton wrote, which I mentioned in my introduction, Ball and Chain. It was the song that Janis, that's what got her her fame, really, was singing that song at Monterey Pop with Big Brother. But the first song that she discovered of Big Mama Thornton's was Hound Dog. And Janis, like everybody in the 50s, who had a TV, her family was one of the few in the neighborhood that had a TV. So they all gathered and saw Elvis on Ed Sullivan and saw him do Hound Dog, and Janis went nuts over the record. But she, already was the student of music, even at that young age, and wanted to find out, well, what is that song? She loved it. And she discovered it had originally been cut in 1952 in Houston by an African-American woman, Big Mama Thornton, and had been an R&B hit. And so on this label, Duke Records out of Houston, which was about an hour and a half away from Janis's town, and she was able to get her hands on that record, and that became her favorite record. So, so again, that was just an example. When she went to college, she would in a folklore class, hear Bessie Smith records, and then, mail away and order records from the Smithsonian of Lead Belly and just study those records. So that's kind of what led her to this group, the Waller Creek Boys, in Austin, Texas, when she was at University of Texas as an art student. And she knew all these blues songs that these guys had never heard of. And at that point in time, there were a few young white men, most of them, college students in the Northeast and California, who had gone on these quests to find these African-American blues artists from the Delta and elsewhere that had been forgotten by the early 60s, but who had recorded in the 20s, and the record business almost totally went under in 1929 when the Great Depression, which horribly is affecting the music business again today with what's going on. But these lost artists and obscure artists were very hard to find out information about, and only a few guys, and Janis was one of the few women who actually sought out this kind of music and learned about it. And she literally changed her voice and created this new style of singing, that kind of raspy, raw, bluesy, emotional style that you guys know, as the way to break through and to create a new sound. Now, she could also sound just like Joan Baez. I mean, she could sing any kind of music. And in fact, when I interviewed one of the guys in Big Brother and the Holding Company, he told me a great story about when they all lived together in a house when they first got together out in Marin County. He and his wife had a little baby, and one night they were trying to put the little girl to bed, and somebody was playing this Joan Baez record really loud. So he goes stomping out of the bedroom to have them turn down the record, and it turns out it was Janis in the other room singing a Joan Baez song, and sounded just like her. So she could really do a lot with her voice. And so I began to discover that this was a woman that worked really hard and had to overcome a lot of obstacles to try to make it as a musician, as I say in the introduction, in a boys club. And so the first time was there in Texas, where she started getting some recognition. She had so much stage fright, believe it or not, they had to really talk her in. It took them months to get her to perform in public. And that was just at the school, the university cafeteria, where they would have a folk sing on Wednesday nights. And once she finally did it and she got that applause and feedback, and they started packing in lots and lots of students, she, that turned her head around, and she loved that feeling of performing. And then finally she got to perform at this cool little beer joint called Threadgills, which was mostly crusty old dudes there. And then they come in, they're the young upstarts, and the old guy who ran the place, Kenneth Threadgill, who had grown up, you know, yodeling in the 30s, loved her music, and kind of became her mentor, and, you know, gave her confidence that she could really make it as a singer. And even though most of the music was the hillbilly music of the day, he would always let her sing blues in this little place, which was also segregated. And she eventually ended up, as Chet Helms said in his introduction that I read from Monterey, hitchhiking to San Francisco in 1963, a week after she turned 20 years old, and first tried to make it on the coffee house circuit in San Francisco and North Beach, primarily, and around Marin County, as a solo artist singing. She was teaching herself guitar, she could play auto harp, and singing blues songs and some folk and country, etc., and things like that. And it was a really, really hard life, but she was determined to make it. And she really worked hard for quite a while, but she had really no sort of infrastructure, no support system. It was so difficult. She was living off tips at these, what they called basket houses, where they pass the hat. You know, maybe she'd be lucky to make $8 or $9, and really didn't have a place to live. So that first venture as trying to make it as a folk singer started in San Francisco. She actually came back east and was in New York for a little while. She loved Bob Dylan and wanted to kind of check out the village scene and play at some of the folk coffee houses in the West Village where Dylan had gotten his start. She did that for a little while in the summer of '64. But right about that time, all these things were happening. That's when the British invasion happened. People started listening to rock and roll. Folk music started taking a back seat to rock and roll. Also, sadly, Janis, who had already discovered alcohol as a way to loosen up, to get rid of her shyness, break down her inhibitions as a singer, was also introduced to methamphetamine. Speed, of course, in those days was around. College students took, you know, pep pills, diet, you know, even housewives are taking the diet pills, whatever. It was very easily prescribed, and she tried it and liked the way it kept her up all night working on her music and all that. So then she was introduced to methamphetamine and became horribly addicted. Ended up going back to Texas, back home to Port Arthur, and lived at home for about a year, went back to college and cleaned up, was totally sober for a year, but started writing songs. She'd already written a few as early as 1962, that one I quoted, "What Good Does Drinkin' Do?" And she started writing some more songs, one called Turtle Blues, that if you know the album Cheap Thrills, you might remember that song came out on the Big Brother and the Holding Company, hugely successful album, Cheap Thrills. Started writing songs, improving her guitar playing. She actually got a 12-string guitar, which is very difficult to play. And in fact, she even, there goes my husband, he just came in from a walk. She even was able to start working a little bit in the studio. And this does not, I have not been able to find a copy of it, but she actually went into the studio in 1965 with someone who played in the Beaumont, Texas Symphony Orchestra, had a little home studio and started recording some of her songs. But she really had that ambition to make it. And eventually she started performing again. She had cleaned up, she was healthy, and she started performing around Texas and started getting some recognition. And that's when that guy, Chet Helms, got in touch with her, and he had started managing Big Brother and the Holding Company, which was a big part of that whole scene of the Avalon Ballroom, etc., which Chet also managed. So that's what took her back to San Francisco in '66 and joined the band. Now, she really loved the adulation that she got. They gradually grew a following in San Francisco. After Monterey Pop, they became huge. That's when they ended up signing a deal with Columbia. They'd had a really bad record deal before, but they signed with Clive Davis, who adored Janis. That was also through the auspices of Albert Grossman, who'd become their manager, who also adored Janis. And you know, again, like I said, she was just made for fame. She loved it. She loved the spotlight and became very successful. But again, just to show you how her ambition to not just to make it as be famous, which she did love, but this was a time, you know, the hippie era when you weren't supposed to be, you know, the whole celebrity culture thing was, you know, considered bourgeois, you know, et cetera, even though she loved it. But at the same time, what really drove her, though, was her music. She wanted to continue doing different kinds of music. And that drive eventually is why she left Big Brother and the Holding Company. They were a great guy to back her up in the beginning, but you know, they didn't have the kind of talent she did, and she wanted to start working with different kinds of musicians. She fell madly in love with Otis Redding and Aretha Franklin. She loved that soulful sound, and she wanted to do more kind of a soul R&B kind of style instead of that kind of blues rock, that kind of garagey psychedelic blues rock that Big Brother were doing. So she ended up leaving the band, and it was very, very difficult time. A lot of fans were mad at her. They said she was selling out and things like that, but she had to do it because she had to do other kinds of music. So if you listen to that solo album that I referenced, I Got the Mobile Cosmic Blues Again, Mama, there's everything on that album from, you know, Rodgers and Hart song, Little Girl Blue, which is incredible, to a song by the Chantels that she loved, Maybe, in the 50s. She loved that girl group sound in the 50s, to a few songs that she wrote, including Cosmic Blues, which is one of my favorite songs Janis ever did. It's just, it shows how developed she'd become as a singer, but also her lyrics. It really spells out, you know, the problems that she did have with depression and anxiety and things that we all have to battle with, but how it affected her and some of the choices that she made, particularly when it came to, you know, drinking heavily and things like that, and eventually horribly led her to heroin. And if you listen to the lyrics, though, you can hear really this woman struggling between trying to find happiness with her music and fulfilling her ambitions, but then also trying to balance that with her personal life, etc. And again, you know, she accomplished so much. It's hard to think sometimes that she was only 27 years old when she passed away. And you know how it is when you're in your mid to late 20s, you're still evolving, developing. You really haven't become the person you're going to be yet. You're still, you know, finding your way. And that's the tragedy of Janis Joplin, is that though she developed and matured so much as an artist and a musician, and you know, working so hard for to, you know, fulfill her ambitions to be the greatest blues singer. In fact, she was asked just about 2 months before she died by her producer, you know, what do you want to do when you're 50? What would you like to be doing when you're 50? And she said, I'd like to be the best blues singer since Bessie Smith. I mean, she never wanted to rest on her laurels. She wanted to keep working, improving. And in fact, horribly, the other breakthrough, by the time she made Pearl, which she started recording in late summer of 1970, mostly in September, and she was in the studio recording it when she suddenly passed away with this horrible overdose. She's actually had been clean. She'd been off heroin for about 5 months. And she was still drinking quite a lot. And, you know, alcohol is actually worse on the throat and on the vocal cords than a drug like heroin. So she ran into her old dealer horribly in Los Angeles at the hotel where she was staying, and got some from him and was doing little, you know, little bits of it, and she got a really, really super pure dose, kind of like what's happening now with the fentanyl overdoses and things. It was very similar to that. Because she had been clean for all those months, her tolerance was way down. She got this super strong dose, and that's what killed her. But at that time, she was doing so well in the recording studio that Paul Rothchild, the producer of this album, who was quite the authoritarian producer, he produced all the early Doors records, and I've interviewed all the guys, and I didn't get to interview Jim, sadly, but the other guys I interviewed, and he was a real taskmaster in the studio. He would make Jim Morrison redo his vocals like 18 times or something. But I got to hear these recordings that Sony Music, Columbia had in their vaults of the two of them talking about the music, and Janis coming up with all these ideas in the studio. And there's Paul Rothchild going like, Janis, that's a great idea. I love that. It's great. It's great. In fact, that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. I was asked by Columbia all these years later, after getting that Columbia House record, to write liner notes for an extended 2 CD set called the Pearl Sessions, in which one CD would be the original record, and then the other CD were all these alternate versions and different takes. And also they included, and I got to hear them talking in the studio about the process of recording. And there was Janis Joplin. She wasn't no dummy. She wasn't just sitting there singing like, sing this, sing that, and which was pretty much the way girl singers were told to sing in those days. She was coming up with guitar part ideas, with tempo changes, with alternate, ideas for the songs. She was really taking the reins in this session. And it turns out, I found out with my research that he was so impressed by her acumen in the studio. Paul Rothchild, of all people, told her road manager, also a musician, Janis should be producing records. And then he told Janis that, and she was so excited that that was going to be next on her list, was to start producing other artists. And I think that's what she would have ended up doing had we not lost her. I think also she would have ended up doing all kinds of other music, because again, if you listen to I Got the Mo Cosmic Blues again and to Pearl, you'll hear all different kinds of stuff. And with Pearl, she was doing, kind of returning to her roots, doing more of a countryish kind of sound. And she fell madly in love, of course, with Chris Christopherson's work as a songwriter. I think she would have done more of his songs. He was kind of the Texas version of Bob Dylan. And I, was just floored by all the work that she did, that I felt that she never really got the credit for. So that's kind of the story that I wanted to tell. That's a very long answer to that question.